Welcome to The Executive Mindset, the podcast that helps you understand how executives think, decide, and act, and more importantly, how to apply those skills in your own context, whether you're leading teams today or preparing to lead them tomorrow. I'm Stephen.
And I'm Edith. Our mission here is simple but powerful: to demystify the aura around executive leadership by showing that their success comes from developed skills, not innate genius. These are learnable capabilities that anyone can master.
Today, we're diving into what might be the most fundamental shift in thinking as you move up in leadership, the transition from delivering results to designing systems. Picture this scenario. A critical product launch is behind schedule. A manager is frantically debugging code, a director is orchestrating team dependencies, and an executive is examining the company's entire incentive structure. The question we're exploring is, when facing a crisis, do you fix the problem or do you fix the system that created it?
Throughout this episode, we'll be covering 3 key areas. First, we'll explore what it really means to shift from task execution to system design. Then, we'll dive into how to identify points of highest leverage in any business process. Finally, we'll learn to diagnose problems at a systemic level rather than just treating symptoms.
These concepts are foundational because they represent the core difference between managing outputs and architecting outcomes. It's the difference between being reactive and being truly strategic. Let's start by examining what this shift actually looks like in practice.
Think about the last time you faced a recurring problem at work. Maybe it was missed deadlines, communication breakdowns, or quality issues. Most of us instinctively jump to fixing the immediate problem. We work late, send more emails, implement more checks. But executives think differently. They ask, why does this problem keep happening?
Exactly, and this gets to the heart of leverage. When you're focused on delivery, you're optimizing for the task at hand. When you're focused on design, you're optimizing for the system that produces tasks. It's the difference between being a skilled craftsperson and being an architect.
I love that analogy. Let me expand on it because it perfectly captures the different levels of thinking. Imagine you're building a house. Managers are the skilled craftspeople. They're laying bricks perfectly, wiring rooms with precision, ensuring every detail meets specifications. They're absolutely essential, and their work is incredibly valuable.
Right, and directors are like the foreman. They're making sure all the different crews, the electricians, plumbers, carpenters, are coordinating effectively. They're ensuring everyone's working on the same floor plan and that the timeline makes sense across all the different work streams.
But executives, they're the architects who designed the entire building's blueprint. They're thinking about the electrical grid, the plumbing infrastructure, the foundation that needs to withstand storms for decades. They're focused on structural integrity and overall function, not whether the living room should be painted blue or green.
This architectural thinking is what we call systems-level perspective. And here's what's fascinating. It's not about being smarter or having better instincts. It's about asking different questions and looking for different patterns.
Let's make this concrete with that product launch scenario I mentioned. When a critical feature is delayed by a dependency team, watch how different levels respond. The manager focuses on the immediate task. My team will work overtime this weekend to code a temporary workaround. We will hit our sprint goal.
The director focuses on cross-team coordination. I will schedule an emergency sync with the other team's director to reprioritize their backlog and see if we can get their feature delivered sooner. We need to align our roadmaps.
But the executive focuses on the system. This isn't a one-time delay, it's a pattern. Why are our teams incentivized to prioritize their own siloed goals over a successful integrated launch? I'm going to propose a shared bonus structure tied to the overall product success and talk to engineering leadership about platform-level investments to reduce these dependencies permanently.
Notice the time horizons here. The manager is thinking in sprints, the director in quarters, but the executive is thinking in years. They're asking, what structural changes prevent this entire class of problems from happening again?
And this is where leverage comes in. Leverage is about finding the smallest intervention that creates the largest impact. If you can change one incentive structure that affects 100 decisions, that's higher leverage than making 100 individual corrections.
Think of it like a mechanical lever. You can move a massive boulder with relatively little effort if you have the right fulcrum and a long enough lever. In organizations, the fulcrum is usually incentives, processes, or systems. The lever is your influence or authority to change them.
Here's a practical way to identify leverage points. Whenever you encounter a problem, ask yourself 3 questions. First, what's the immediate cause? Second, what's the process or system that allowed this cause to exist? And third, what would have to change structurally to make this type of problem impossible or much less likely?
Let's walk through an example. Say your team consistently misses deadlines. The immediate cause might be poor time estimation. The systemic cause might be that there's no process for incorporating learning from past estimates, or that people are incentivized to give optimistic estimates to win projects.
Exactly. The manager fixes this by working harder or implementing better project tracking. The director fixes this by improving estimation processes across teams. But the executive asks, why are we structured in a way that rewards unrealistic estimates? Maybe we need to change how we evaluate and reward project planning, or create feedback loops that make accurate estimation a competitive advantage.
This systems thinking also applies to identifying what we call structural debt. Just like technical debt, structural debt accumulates when you make short-term fixes without addressing underlying design issues.
Structural debt shows up as those recurring meetings that everyone dreads but no one cancels, processes that require constant manual intervention, or roles that exist primarily to work around other broken roles. These are symptoms of systemic issues that need architectural solutions.
The key insight is that most organizational problems aren't people problems, they're design problems. When good people consistently produce poor outcomes, it's usually because the system is designed to produce those outcomes.
This reminds me of the saying, every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. If you're getting results you don't want, you need to redesign the system, not just work harder within the existing system.
So how do you develop this systems perspective? Start by looking for patterns rather than incidents. When something goes wrong, instead of asking who did this, ask what conditions made this likely to happen.
Also, pay attention to where energy gets wasted in your organization. Repeated explanations, constant rework, frequent escalations, these are usually signs that the system design is fighting against the desired outcomes.
Another powerful technique is to map the incentives. For any recurring problem, ask what are people actually rewarded for doing? Not what they're supposed to be rewarded for, but what behaviors actually get recognized, promoted, or compensated.
Often, you'll find that the formal incentives and the real incentives are completely misaligned. People are told to collaborate but rewarded for individual achievement. They're told to take smart risks but punished for any failure. The executive's job is to align these incentives with the outcomes you actually want.
Now, let's talk about how to prioritize when you're thinking systemically. Not every system needs to be redesigned, and you can't fix everything at once. This is where frameworks like the effort versus impact matrix become invaluable.
The idea is simple. Plot potential initiatives on a grid with effort on one axis and impact on the other. You want to prioritize high-impact, low-effort changes first. These are your quick wins that build momentum for bigger systemic changes.
But here's what's counterintuitive. Sometimes the highest leverage changes feel like low impact because their effects are invisible. Preventing problems is less visible than solving them. Creating clarity is less visible than managing confusion.
This is why executives often seem to focus on things that don't look urgent to others. They're working on the structural changes that prevent future crises, not just responding to current ones.
As we wrap up, let's think about how you can apply this immediately. Take one recurring, frustrating problem your team faces. Instead of jumping to solutions, spend 30 minutes mapping it out systemically. What's the immediate cause versus the systemic driver? What interventions could you make at the task level, process level, and system level?
And ask yourself, how much of your week is spent delivering versus designing? The higher you go in leadership, the more your value comes from designing systems that enable others to deliver rather than delivering directly yourself.
The goal isn't to stop caring about execution. Execution matters enormously, but it's to ensure that your execution efforts are building systems that make future execution more effective and efficient.
Remember, executive thinking isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions and looking for leverage points that others might miss. These are skills you can develop regardless of your current role.
In our next episode, we'll be exploring how executives think about risk, optionality, and second-order effects. We'll dive into probabilistic, long-horizon thinking and examine why executives are paid to make the right bets, not necessarily to be right every time.
Until then, challenge yourself to think like an architect, not just a craftsperson. Look for the systems behind the symptoms, and remember, the most powerful interventions often feel invisible until you see their results.
This has been The Executive Mindset. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to The Executive Mindset. I'm Steven, and today we're diving into something that fundamentally separates executives from other leaders, how they think about uncertainty, risk, and time. In our last episode, we explored how executives shift from delivering tasks to designing systems. But once you're designing those systems, how do you make decisions when the future is inherently unknowable?
That's exactly right. I'm Edith, and today we're exploring probabilistic, long-horizon thinking. We'll unpack 3 critical concepts that define executive decision-making: understanding the difference between optimizing for certainty versus planning for probabilities, grasping the strategic value of creating future options even when they cost you today, and learning to analyze the hidden second-order effects that ripple out from every major decision.
These concepts are crucial because they build directly on our systems thinking from episode 1. Once you understand that your job is to design the architecture of success rather than execute individual tasks, you realize that architecture must account for an uncertain future. You're not just building for today's known requirements, you're building resilience and adaptability into the system itself.
Think about it this way. When you're a manager focused on execution, certainty is your friend. You want predictable outcomes, clear metrics, reliable processes. But as you move up, you're dealing with longer time horizons, where certainty becomes not just impossible, but actually dangerous if you're optimizing for it.
That's a fascinating point. Why is optimizing for certainty dangerous at the executive level?
Because when you optimize for certainty, you're essentially betting everything on one future scenario. You're like a farmer who plants only one crop because they know exactly how to grow it perfectly. But what happens when there's an unexpected drought, or when market preferences shift, or when a new technology changes everything? The farmer who only knows how to grow corn is in serious trouble.
So executives need to think more like portfolio managers of a vast, diverse farm.
Exactly. A manager treats each project like a single precious plant they must water perfectly to guarantee it grows. They're optimizing for the success of that one plant. A director manages a garden, making sure all the plants get the resources they need. But an executive thinks like a portfolio manager of a vast farm with different climates and growing seasons.
And that portfolio manager knows some crops will fail due to unforeseen weather conditions, market changes, or other factors entirely outside their control.
Right. So they plant different types of seeds. That's optionality. They diversify not just to spread risk, but to capture different types of upside. And critically, they think about how planting a certain crop will affect the soil quality for years to come. That's second-order thinking. Their goal is the total long-term health of the portfolio, not the success of any individual plant.
Let's make this concrete with a real scenario. Imagine you're facing a classic executive decision. You have funds to either acquire a small, stable competitor that will immediately boost your market share by 5%, or invest that same money in an internal R&D platform that might not pay off for 3 years and has significant risk of failure.
This is where you see the different levels of thinking clearly. A manager focused on execution looks at this and says, the acquisition is obviously better. It gives us guaranteed market share increase this quarter, which helps me hit my immediate KPIs. They're optimizing for certainty and short-term results.
A director might take a slightly broader view, analyzing the acquisition's integration plan and concluding it seems safer with predictable ROI that their teams can execute against reliably, still focused on what they can control and predict.
But here's where executive thinking diverges completely. An executive looks at the same choice and says, the acquisition gives us a predictable future, but it's also a low-growth future. We're essentially buying 5% market share, but we're not buying the capability to generate ongoing market share gains.
They're thinking about optionality, what future opportunities each choice creates or forecloses.
Exactly. The R&D platform investment might fail, but if it succeeds, it could unlock 3 new potential product lines. It's not just about the direct return on investment, it's about the options it creates. Think of it like buying a ticket that might be worthless, but if it hits, it doesn't just pay out once, it gives you the right to buy more tickets in an entirely new game.
That's a powerful way to frame it. But how do you actually evaluate these kinds of probabilistic decisions? You can't just go with gut instinct when you're responsible for major resource allocation.
This is where expected value calculations become essential, but not in the oversimplified way most people think about them. Let's break down that acquisition versus R&D decision. The acquisition might have a 90% chance of delivering that 5% market share increase, with maybe a 10% chance of integration problems that reduce the benefit to 2%.
So the expected value of the acquisition is roughly 4.5% market share gain, 90% times 5% plus 10% times 2%.
Right. Now, the R&D platform might have a 30% chance of creating breakthrough technology that captures 15% new market share, a 50% chance of modest success yielding 3% market share, and a 20% chance of complete failure yielding 0.
That gives you an expected value of about 6% market share, 30% times 15 plus 50% times 3 plus 20% times 0. So purely on expected value, the R&D investment wins.
But here's where executive thinking goes beyond the math. That calculation assumes market share is the only variable that matters, and that the value of market share is linear. An executive is thinking about second-order effects. What signal does each decision send to the market about your company's strategic direction? What does it do to your company's culture and capabilities?
Those second-order effects can be enormous. If you acquire instead of investing in R&D, you might signal to the market that you're focused on incremental growth rather than innovation. That could affect your ability to attract top talent, your stock valuation, even your customers' perception of your brand.
And internally, acquisition sends a message that the path to growth is buying rather than building. That can create a cultural dependency on external solutions rather than developing internal capabilities. You might win this quarter's market share battle, but lose the war for long-term competitive advantage.
On the flip side, choosing the risky R&D investment signals that you're willing to bet on your team's ability to create breakthrough solutions. Even if that specific platform fails, you're building a culture of innovation and internal capability development.
That's a perfect example of second-order thinking. The primary effect is the direct outcome of your decision. The second-order effect is how that decision changes the system itself, your organization's culture, capabilities, market position, and stakeholder relationships.
Let's dive deeper into this concept of optionality, because I think it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of executive decision-making. How do you balance the cost of creating options against the certainty of direct returns?
Think of optionality like insurance, but insurance that pays you if good things happen instead of protecting you when bad things happen. You pay a premium today for the right, but not the obligation, to take advantage of future opportunities. A great example is how tech companies approach platform investments.
Like when Amazon built AWS infrastructure initially just to support their own e-commerce operations, but then realized they could offer it as a service to other companies?
Exactly. They didn't build AWS because they had a clear vision of creating a cloud computing empire. They built it to solve their own scaling problems. But the way they built it, as a modular, scalable platform rather than a custom solution, preserved the option to monetize it externally. That optionality has generated more value than their original retail business.
So creating optionality isn't about predicting the future. It's about building capabilities and positions that allow you to capitalize on multiple possible futures.
Right. And this connects back to our portfolio thinking. You're not trying to pick the one winning investment. You're trying to construct a portfolio where you benefit from uncertainty rather than suffer from it. Some options will expire worthless, but the ones that pay off can pay off enormously.
But there's a real tension here for executives, especially those coming from manager and director roles where success was measured by predictable delivery. How do you justify spending resources on options that might never be exercised?
This is where risk appetite becomes critical and where many organizations struggle. You need different risk frameworks for different types of decisions. Core product optimization should have low risk tolerance. You need reliable, predictable improvements to your existing business. But new market exploration or platform investments should have much higher risk tolerance because the potential upside justifies the uncertainty.
It's like having different investment strategies for different portions of your portfolio. Your retirement funds might be in stable bonds, but you might allocate a smaller portion to high-risk, high-reward investments.
Exactly. And just like a financial portfolio manager, an executive needs to be explicit about their risk allocation. What percentage of your resources are you willing to dedicate to high uncertainty, high optionality bets? What percentage needs to go to reliable, predictable operations?
This brings us to a crucial point about time horizons. Manager-level decisions often have immediate or short-term consequences. Director-level decisions might play out over quarters or a year, but executive decisions can have consequences that unfold over multiple years or even decades.
And the longer your time horizon, the more uncertainty compounds. It's like trying to predict where a ball will land when you throw it 5 feet versus trying to predict where it will land when you throw it a mile. Small variations in initial conditions create massive differences in outcomes over longer periods.
Which means executives have to be comfortable with what we might call productive uncertainty. They're not trying to eliminate uncertainty, they're trying to position their organizations to thrive regardless of which specific future materializes.
That's beautifully put, productive uncertainty. And this is why second-order thinking becomes so crucial. You can't predict the specific future, but you can often predict the types of changes and forces that will shape whatever future emerges.
Can you give us an example of how second-order thinking might work in practice?
Sure. Let's say you're deciding whether to invest in remote work infrastructure for your company. The first-order effect is pretty straightforward. You spend money on technology and save money on office space. But the second-order effects ripple out in multiple directions.
You might be able to hire talent from a much wider geographic area, which could improve the quality of your workforce.
Right. And if your competitors don't make the same investment, you gain a competitive advantage in talent acquisition. But there are also potential negative second-order effects. Company culture might become harder to maintain. Informal knowledge transfer might decrease. Innovation that comes from serendipitous conversations might suffer.
And then there are third-order effects. If remote work becomes widespread in your industry, it might change salary expectations, reshape urban real estate markets, alter customer expectations about service availability, or create new types of security vulnerabilities.
Exactly. An executive isn't trying to predict all these effects perfectly, but they are trying to understand the system well enough to make decisions that create resilience and optionality regardless of which specific effects dominate.
This connects to something we discussed in our first episode about systems thinking. You're not just making a decision about remote work, you're redesigning the system of how your organization operates, and that system change will interact with other changing systems in unpredictable ways.
And this is where probabilistic thinking becomes essential. Instead of asking, will remote work be good for our company? You ask, what are the various ways remote work could play out? What's the rough probability of each scenario? And how can we position ourselves to benefit from the most likely positive scenarios while minimizing the impact of negative ones?
So executive decision-making becomes less about being right and more about being prepared for multiple possible versions of being right.
That's a great way to put it. You're optimizing for expected value across multiple scenarios rather than trying to maximize the outcome in one specific scenario. And you're explicitly paying for options that allow you to adapt as more information becomes available.
Let's talk about how leaders can develop this kind of thinking. For someone who's been successful by delivering predictable results, how do they learn to embrace this level of uncertainty?
Start small and practice the framework systematically. Instead of making your next decision with a simple pros and cons list, try breaking it down probabilistically. What are the possible outcomes? What's your best estimate of the probability of each outcome? What's the expected value of each choice?
And pay attention to second-order effects. Ask yourself, if this decision works exactly as planned, what will that success change about our organization, our market, or our stakeholders? If it fails, what will that failure teach us or enable us to do differently?
The key is recognizing that this isn't just an analytical exercise. It's a mental model that changes how you see leadership itself. You shift from trying to control outcomes to trying to shape probabilities. You move from avoiding risk to managing risk intelligently.
And perhaps most importantly, you start thinking of your role as creating an organization that can learn and adapt quickly rather than one that executes a predetermined plan perfectly.
Which brings us full circle to the systems thinking we discussed last episode. You're designing systems that are robust to uncertainty, that create options rather than foreclose them, and that get stronger rather than weaker when the unexpected happens.
As we wrap up, what's the key takeaway for our listeners who want to develop this executive mindset around probabilistic thinking?
Stop trying to be right about the future. Start trying to be prepared for multiple possible futures. Build optionality into your decisions. Calculate expected values. Always ask about second-order effects. And remember that your job isn't to eliminate uncertainty, it's to position your organization to thrive because of uncertainty, not despite it.
That's powerful. Think like a portfolio manager, not like a project manager. Plan for probabilities, not just possibilities. And always consider how your decisions today will change the game you're playing tomorrow.
Next time on The Executive Mindset, we'll explore how to apply these concepts when you need to influence and align people you don't directly control. We'll dive into stakeholder management, narrative building, and how executives shape culture through strategic communication. The skills we've discussed today about probabilistic thinking become crucial when you're trying to get buy-in for uncertain long-term bets from people who might prefer predictable short-term wins.
Until then, challenge yourself to take one upcoming decision and map it out probabilistically instead of just listing pros and cons. What are the possible outcomes? What are their probabilities? What options does each choice create or eliminate? And most importantly, what second-order effects might you be overlooking? Welcome back to The Executive Mindset. I'm Stephen, and joining me as always is Edith. Today we're diving into one of the most misunderstood aspects of executive leadership, influence without direct control. We're going to explore how to map and engage stakeholders outside your chain of command, how to use narrative and incentives to drive alignment, and perhaps most importantly, how to shift from simply resolving conflicts to proactively shaping the entire environment around you.
That's right. And this builds perfectly on our previous episode where we discussed probabilistic thinking and managing portfolios of decisions. Because once you understand how to make those complex, long-horizon bets, the next challenge becomes how do you actually execute them when success depends on people you don't directly manage?
Exactly. Think about it. When a manager wants something done, they can assign tasks to their team. When a director needs alignment, they can call a meeting with their peer directors. But when an executive needs to drive change, they're often working through board members, investors, regulatory bodies, customer advocacy groups, even competitors in some cases. The question becomes, how do you shape outcomes when you can't simply issue directives?
It's fascinating because this is where we see the biggest leap in thinking. Most people assume executive power comes from having a bigger hammer, more authority, larger budgets, the ability to fire people. But that's actually backwards. Real executive influence comes from understanding that your job isn't to control the orchestra, it's to conduct it.
I love that metaphor. Let's unpack it. When we say an executive is like a conductor, what exactly do we mean?
Well, think about what a conductor actually does. They don't play a single instrument themselves. They can't directly produce any sound. But they shape the interpretation of the music for dozens of independent experts, each with their own technical skills and artistic opinions. The conductor influences through gestures, through setting tempo and dynamics, through communication that aligns everyone toward a single, cohesive performance.
And that's the key distinction. A manager leads their section directly. Let's say the violins, ensuring they play their notes perfectly. A director coordinates adjacent sections, making sure violins, violas, and cellos are in sync. But the executive conductor is thinking about the entire audience experience, the emotional journey of the performance, how this piece fits into the season's repertoire.
Right. And here's what's crucial. The conductor's power comes from their ability to create a shared vision that transcends what any individual musician could achieve alone. When a world-class violinist follows a conductor's tempo, it's not because they have to. It's because they understand how their part contributes to something greater.
This is where narrative becomes so important. Let's say there's a major product quality crisis that damages customer trust. A manager focuses on fixing the immediate technical problem. A director coordinates a cross-functional response. But an executive is thinking about the story this crisis tells, both internally and externally.
Exactly. They're not just solving the problem, they're shaping how the problem gets understood. Instead of framing it as a QA failure, they might position it as a company-wide conversation about speed versus quality. That reframing changes everything. Suddenly, it's not about blame, it's about strategic priorities that everyone can engage with constructively.
And this connects back to stakeholder mapping. The executive in this scenario isn't just managing down to their team or across to peer executives. They're thinking about board members who need to understand the company's risk management capabilities, customers who need reassurance about the brand's commitment to quality, maybe even industry analysts who influence broader market perception.
Which brings us to one of the most practical tools for this level of influence, stakeholder mapping. Think of it like a strategic chessboard where you need to understand not just your pieces, but how all the pieces interact with each other.
Walk us through how that works in practice.
You start with a simple quadrant: high influence versus low influence on one axis, high interest versus low interest on the other. Then you plot every key stakeholder: board members, major investors, regulatory contacts, key customers, peer executives, even influential individual contributors who don't report to you but whose opinions carry weight.
And the magic happens when you realize that each quadrant requires a completely different communication strategy. High-influence, high-interest stakeholders need detailed, proactive communication. High-influence, low-interest need just enough information to prevent them from becoming obstacles. Low-influence, high-interest might become your advocates if you invest in them properly.
But here's where it gets sophisticated. You're not just managing individual relationships, you're thinking about the network effects. How does your conversation with the CFO influence what they say to the board? How does your messaging to key customers ripple through their industry networks? You're conducting a multi-dimensional conversation where every interaction shapes the broader narrative.
This is why alignment scripts become so valuable. You can't wing these conversations when there's so much at stake. Having a clear framework helps you quickly establish common ground and move toward productive action.
The template is deceptively simple. I see your goal is X, my goal is Y. It seems our common ground is Z. Can we agree to prioritize Z first? But it works because it acknowledges different perspectives while creating a path forward that everyone can support.
Let's make this concrete with an example. Imagine you're an executive trying to drive adoption of a new technology platform across multiple business units. Each unit has different priorities, different success metrics, different timelines. How do you create alignment without having direct authority over any of them?
This is where you have to think like a conductor again. You can't force the violins to play louder, but you can shape the entire musical interpretation so that playing louder serves their artistic goals too. Maybe for the sales team, you frame the platform as a way to reduce time spent on administrative tasks so they can focus on high-value customer interactions. For the operations team, it's about risk reduction and compliance. For the product team, it's about better customer data and faster iteration cycles.
So you're creating what we might call aligned incentives through narrative. Each stakeholder group gets a version of the story that connects to their existing motivations, but all the stories point toward the same outcome: platform adoption.
And this is where the proactive aspect becomes critical. You're not waiting for conflicts to emerge and then trying to resolve them. You're anticipating where misalignment might occur and shaping the environment to prevent it. Maybe you know the sales team is worried about short-term disruption to their quarterly numbers, so you work with finance to create a transition bonus structure. You're conducting the orchestra before the performance even begins.
This connects to something really important about executive presence. There's this misconception that executive presence is about being the most charismatic person in the room, or having all the answers, or being able to dominate any conversation. But what we're describing is almost the opposite.
Right. It's more like being the person who can see patterns and connections that others miss, and then helping everyone else see them too. It's about creating conditions where other smart people can do their best work toward shared goals. The most effective executives are often the ones who make complex situations feel simple and clear, not the ones who demonstrate how complex and smart they are.
And this is where the distinction between power and influence becomes so important. Power says, do this because I said so. Influence says, here's why doing this serves your goals too. Power works within your span of control. Influence works everywhere.
Think about how this plays out in something as basic as budget allocation meetings. A manager argues for more resources for their team. A director tries to optimize resource distribution across their programs. But an executive is thinking about the signal that budget decisions send to the entire organization about strategic priorities.
They might intentionally fund a project that has lower ROI but higher symbolic value for the cultural shift they're trying to drive. Or they might very publicly cut a profitable program because continuing it would send the wrong message about the company's future direction.
And here's what's really sophisticated about this level of thinking. You're managing multiple time horizons simultaneously. The immediate decision about budget allocation, the medium-term signal it sends about priorities, and the long-term cultural norm it establishes about how decisions get made.
This is why executives often seem to be playing a different game than everyone else. They are. They're not just solving today's problems, they're shaping the context in which future problems will be understood and solved.
Which brings us back to that idea about shaping conversations in rooms you're not even in. When you're truly influencing at an executive level, your perspective and priorities get carried forward by other people because they've internalized your framework for thinking about problems.
So let's talk about how someone can start developing these skills. If you're currently managing directly or directing through formal authority, how do you begin building influence beyond your span of control?
Start with stakeholder mapping for one specific initiative you're working on, not your entire job, just one project. Identify 3 people whose buy-in would dramatically increase your chances of success, but who don't report to you. Then practice that alignment script framework with each of them.
And pay attention to the narratives that already exist in your organization. What stories do people tell about why things succeed or fail? What language do they use to describe problems and solutions? You can't shape the narrative if you don't understand what it currently is.
I think one of the most practical exercises is to pick one recurring conflict or area of misalignment and ask yourself, instead of resolving this after it happens again, what would it look like to prevent it from happening in the first place? What conditions would need to be different?
That's the shift from reactive problem solving to proactive environment shaping. And it requires thinking like a systems architect, not just a firefighter.
Because ultimately, executive influence is about designing systems, cultural systems, communication systems, incentive systems that produce the outcomes you need without requiring your constant intervention. You're building machines that make good decisions even when you're not around to run them.
Which brings us full circle to the conductor metaphor. The best conductors create conditions where the orchestra can perform brilliantly even during the parts of the symphony when they're barely moving their baton.
And that's really the test of executive influence. Do things continue to move in the right direction when you're not in the room? Are your priorities and perspectives being carried forward by people who've adopted your framework for thinking about problems?
As we wrap up today's discussion, I want to emphasize that this isn't about manipulation or political maneuvering. It's about alignment and clarity. When done well, everyone wins because everyone understands how their individual success contributes to collective success.
The most powerful executives are the ones who make other people more effective at achieving their own goals. That's how you build the kind of influence that transcends organizational charts and formal authority structures.
So for our listeners, here's your challenge. Identify one stakeholder relationship that's critical to your current priorities but outside your direct control. Use the stakeholder mapping framework to understand their perspective and interests. Then draft a 5-sentence alignment script to open a conversation about shared goals.
And remember, this is a skill that requires practice. Start small with lower stakes situations and build your confidence and capability over time. Executive influence isn't about being perfect, it's about being thoughtful and intentional about how you engage with the broader system you're operating in.
Next time on The Executive Mindset, we'll be exploring strategy execution, specifically how to decide where to play and how to win when you have unlimited good ideas but limited resources. We'll dive into the art of strategic trade-offs and why the hardest part of strategy isn't coming up with good ideas, it's killing them.
Until next time, this has been the Executive Mindset. Keep conducting your orchestra.
Welcome back to the Executive Mindset. I'm Stephen, and with me as always is Edith. In our last episode, we explored how executives influence without direct control, working as conductors of an orchestra to shape stakeholders and culture across the organization. But there's a critical question we need to address. Once you've aligned all those stakeholders and shaped the narrative, how do you actually decide what that narrative should be about? How do you choose where to focus your limited resources?
That's exactly the right question, because today we're diving into one of the most challenging aspects of executive leadership, strategy execution. Specifically, we're talking about deciding where to play and how to win. We'll explore how strategy is fundamentally a framework for making trade-offs, why saying no to good opportunities is essential for funding great ones, and how to translate high-level vision into concrete resource allocation choices.
These concepts are crucial because they represent the bridge between all that stakeholder influence we discussed last time and the accountability we'll be exploring in our next episode. You can't be accountable for outcomes if you haven't made clear choices about which outcomes matter most. And you can't influence stakeholders effectively if you're trying to do everything at once.
Exactly. Now, here's what I find fascinating about this topic. Most people think strategy is about having brilliant insights or revolutionary ideas. But the real challenge isn't generating good ideas, it's killing them. Every organization is drowning in opportunities, and the executive's job is to be the one who says no to most of them.
That sounds almost counterintuitive, doesn't it? We're conditioned to think that more opportunities equal more success. But you're suggesting that's actually backwards at the executive level.
It is backwards, and here's why. Think about the fundamental difference in how resources work at different organizational levels. A manager is fighting to get more resources for their team. A director is trying to distribute resources fairly across their domain. But an executive is working with a fixed pool of resources and has to decide where they'll create the most value. It's not about fairness or even about maximizing individual team performance. It's about maximizing organizational performance.
So we're talking about a completely different optimization problem. Can you help us understand what this looks like in practice?
Absolutely. I love using the metaphor of a portfolio gardener to illustrate this. Imagine you're managing a large estate with multiple gardens. A manager is like someone responsible for a single plant bed. They want as much water and fertilizer as possible to make their bed thrive. A director oversees several beds and tries to distribute resources fairly among them. But the executive is the head gardener of the entire estate.
And as the head gardener, you're working with finite water and fertilizer.
Exactly. Your job isn't to water every bed equally or even to make sure every bed survives. Your job is to decide which beds will produce the most valuable harvest for the entire estate. You might intentionally let a good vegetable patch wither to divert all the water to a great orchard that will feed the estate for years. You're choosing where to play and how to win.
That's a powerful image, but I imagine this creates some uncomfortable moments, especially when you're essentially telling people their good ideas aren't going to get funding.
Oh, absolutely. Let me paint a picture of how this plays out in the real world. Picture the annual budget allocation meeting. The manager walks in saying they need to increase their team's headcount by 15% to deliver all the features on their roadmap. The director argues that their program is critical and they need funding for projects A, B, and C to expand their scope and hit their targets.
Those are both reasonable requests from their perspectives, right? They're doing their jobs.
They are, but here's where the executive mindset has to be fundamentally different. The executive looks at this situation and says, we have 10 good project proposals, but we only have enough runway to fund 3 of them to a great level. Project B, while promising, doesn't align with our core strategy of winning the enterprise market. We're cutting it entirely and reallocating its budget to fully fund Project A. I'm redefining this year's success metric from scope delivered to enterprise market share captured.
Notice what happened there. The executive didn't just make a resource decision, they redefined what success looks like. They moved from measuring inputs and activities to measuring strategic outcomes.
That's such a crucial distinction, and it highlights something really important about executive-level thinking. You're not just allocating existing resources, you're actively shaping the organization's understanding of what matters. You're teaching everyone else how to think about trade-offs.
But how do you make these decisions systematically?
It can't just be gut instinct, especially when you're dealing with complex organizations and multiple competing priorities.
You're absolutely right. And this is where frameworks become essential. One tool that's particularly powerful is what I call a decision rubric for make, partner, or buy. Instead of making emotional decisions based on who presented most persuasively or which project sounds most exciting, you create a scorecard that evaluates opportunities against your strategic criteria.
Can you walk us through how that might work?
Sure. Let's say your strategic criteria include market size, competitive advantage, resource requirements, timeline to value, and strategic alignment. For each opportunity, you score it against these criteria. The key is being brutally honest about the scores, and then making disciplined choices based on the data, not on politics or personalities.
And the discipline part is crucial because I imagine there's always pressure to make exceptions or to try to fund one more project.
Exactly. And that's where another tool becomes invaluable, the portfolio prioritization template. This forces you to stack rank initiatives from 1 to N with a clear-cut line determined by your available resources. Everything below that line is officially not happening this year. No exceptions, no maybe we can find a way, no keeping projects on life support.
That sounds almost harsh, but I suppose clarity is better than false hope.
It is better, and here's why. When you're clear about what you're not doing, you free everyone up to focus on what you are doing. Ambiguity about priorities creates organizational drag because people waste energy trying to keep everything alive. Clarity about priorities creates organizational momentum because everyone can align their efforts.
This connects back to our discussion of influence from the last episode, doesn't it? Part of how executives shape the narrative is by being crystal clear about where the organization is placing its bets.
Absolutely. When you make tough trade-off decisions visible and explain the strategic logic behind them, you're not just allocating resources, you're teaching the organization how to think strategically. You're modeling the kind of decision-making you want to see replicated at every level.
But let's be honest about something. This is emotionally difficult work. You're saying no to people's pet projects, potential career ambitions, things they genuinely believe in. How do you manage the human side of these decisions?
That's such an important question, and it gets to the heart of why this work requires a different kind of leadership. You have to separate the quality of ideas from the strategic fit of ideas. A project can be well conceived, expertly executed, and still be the wrong choice for your organization at this time. Your job is to help people understand that saying no to their idea isn't saying no to them as professionals.
And presumably, part of that is being transparent about your decision-making process rather than making these calls behind closed doors.
Exactly. When people understand the criteria you're using and can see how you applied them consistently, they can disagree with your priorities without feeling like the process was unfair or arbitrary. They might not like the outcome, but they can respect the reasoning.
Now, I want to dig into something that I think trips up a lot of leaders at this level. How do you translate these high-level strategic choices into day-to-day execution? Because it's one thing to say, we're focusing on enterprise market share, and another thing to make sure that focus actually drives behavior throughout the organization.
That's where the rubber meets the road, isn't it? You have to cascade these strategic choices down through the organization in a way that changes how people make their own daily trade-offs. It's not enough to communicate the strategy once in a big meeting. You have to embed it in how people think about their work.
Can you give us a concrete example of what that cascading looks like?
Sure. Let's say you've decided to focus on enterprise market share. At the product level, this might mean saying no to consumer-friendly features that don't resonate with IT buyers. At the sales level, it might mean changing commission structures to reward enterprise deals over volume. At the marketing level, it might mean shifting budget from broad awareness campaigns to account-based marketing for specific enterprise targets.
So the strategic choice creates a cascade of operational choices throughout the organization.
Exactly, and each of those operational choices needs to reinforce the strategic message. If you say you're focused on enterprise, but your product roadmap is full of consumer features and your sales team is still optimized for volume, then your strategy is just wishful thinking.
This makes me think about measurement systems too. How do you ensure that your metrics are aligned with these strategic choices?
That's absolutely critical. Your measurement system is probably the most powerful tool you have for driving behavior. If you're measuring scope delivered, but your strategy requires depth over breadth, you're going to get scope delivered, regardless of what you say in meetings. You have to be willing to change how you measure success to match how you've defined success.
And presumably, this is where a lot of strategies fail, in the gap between what leaders say matters and what the organization actually rewards.
Exactly. I've seen so many organizations with beautiful strategy documents that have no connection to how people are evaluated or promoted or compensated. The organization learns to ignore the strategy because it's clear that the real priorities are whatever drives the numbers that leaders actually track.
Let's talk about timing for a moment. When should executives be making these kinds of portfolio decisions? Is this an annual planning exercise, or should it be more continuous?
Both, actually. You need the discipline of annual planning to force the hard trade-off conversations, but you also need the agility to adjust as circumstances change. The key is having clear criteria and processes so that when you do need to reallocate resources, everyone understands why and how you're making those decisions.
And I imagine that in fast-moving environments, the ability to make these reallocation decisions quickly becomes a competitive advantage.
Absolutely. Organizations that can identify failing bets early and reallocate resources to emerging opportunities are going to outperform organizations that stick with their original plans regardless of changing circumstances. But that requires both the frameworks to make good decisions and the organizational courage to act on those decisions.
Speaking of courage, let's address something that I think makes this work particularly challenging: the temptation to hedge your bets. Instead of making clean choices, many leaders try to fund everything at a lower level. Why doesn't that work?
Because half-funded initiatives rarely succeed. When you spread your resources too thin, you don't get half the value from each initiative. You often get no value from any of them. It's better to fully fund 3 initiatives that can actually succeed than to partially fund 10 initiatives that will all struggle.
It's like the gardening metaphor again. Better to have 3 thriving beds than 10 struggling ones.
Exactly. And there's a psychological element too. When teams know they're fully funded and prioritized, they bring a different level of energy and commitment than when they know they're competing for resources and attention with 9 other initiatives.
That raises an interesting point about organizational energy. How did these strategic choices affect the overall momentum and morale of the organization?
Great question. When done well, clear strategic choices actually boost morale because people can see how their work connects to something meaningful and achievable. There's nothing more demoralizing than working on something that you suspect doesn't really matter or won't get the resources it needs to succeed.
Conversely, when strategic choices are unclear or constantly changing, people lose confidence in leadership's ability to make decisions.
Exactly. And that's where we start to see the connection to our next episode on accountability and resilience. Part of being accountable as an executive is making clear choices that people can execute against. If your strategy is so vague or changeable that people can't make progress, that's a leadership failure, not an execution failure.
Before we wrap up, let's give our listeners something practical they can do immediately. What's one exercise someone could try this week to apply these concepts?
Here's what I'd recommend. Take one team's project list or product line and run a 15-minute prioritization session. Use the decision rubric we talked about to force a choice about what to stop doing. The key word there is force. Don't allow ties, don't allow we'll figure out how to do both. Make an actual choice and communicate the reasoning behind it.
And I'd add this. Pay attention to your own emotional reaction when you're forced to make those choices. Notice where you feel resistance to saying no, because that will tell you something important about where your organization might be avoiding necessary trade-offs.
That's such a valuable observation. The discomfort you feel when making these choices is often proportional to how much your organization needed them to be made.
As we look toward our next episode, we'll be exploring what happens after you've made these strategic choices. How do you maintain accountability for the outcomes, build the resilience to navigate setbacks, and create a personal operating model that allows you to sustain this level of decision-making over time? Because strategy execution isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing discipline that requires both organizational systems and personal practices.
Until then, remember, the hardest part of strategy isn't coming up with good ideas. It's having the courage to kill them in service of great ones. Thanks for listening to The Executive Mindset.
Welcome to the Executive Mindset, where we decode the skills that separate effective leaders from the rest. I'm Stephen, and I'm here with Edith to explore what it truly means to think and operate like an executive. Today, we're diving into perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of senior leadership: how to maintain accountability, build resilience, and create a personal operating system that can withstand the storms of executive responsibility.
That's right. We've spent our previous episodes exploring how executives think differently about problems, people, systems, and strategy. But there's a crucial question we haven't fully addressed. What happens when things go wrong? How do you maintain your effectiveness when you're ultimately accountable for outcomes that involve hundreds of variables, most of which are outside your direct control?
Exactly. In our last episode, we talked about strategy execution and the executive as the head gardener making tough resource allocation decisions. But what we didn't explore is what happens when that orchard you invested everything in gets hit by an unexpected frost. How do you handle that moment when the board is asking tough questions, your team is looking to you for answers, and you're the one who has to stand up and own the result?
Today, we're going to explore three interconnected concepts that distinguish executive-level leadership. First, the fundamental shift from managing tasks to owning outcomes, both the successes and the failures. Second, we'll discuss resilience strategies that allow executives to manage the unique stress and ambiguity that comes with senior roles. And finally, we'll dive into building what we call a personal operating model, a systematic approach to managing your time, energy, and key relationships at the executive level.
These concepts are critical because they address a fundamental misconception about executive work. Many people assume that reaching the executive level means you have more control, more certainty, and more support. In reality, it's often the opposite. You have ultimate accountability for outcomes with less direct control over the variables that drive those outcomes. You're operating in an environment with higher stakes, more ambiguity, and often less immediate feedback on whether your decisions are working.
Think about it this way. When you're a manager, your success is largely determined by your team's execution of specific tasks. When you're a director, your success comes from coordinating multiple teams toward departmental goals. But when you're an executive, your success is measured by organizational outcomes that depend on market conditions, competitive responses, regulatory changes, and dozens of other factors you can influence but can't control.
So let's start with accountability. What does it mean to truly own outcomes rather than just manage tasks? This is where we see one of the most significant mindset shifts in the progression from manager to executive.
I love using the metaphor of a ship's captain to illustrate this. A manager is like an expert engineer in the engine room. They're responsible for keeping their specific engine running flawlessly. They know every bolt, every gauge, every sound that engine makes. Their accountability is clear: keep the engine running at optimal performance.
And a director would be like the officer of the deck, coordinating between different parts of the crew, ensuring the ship follows the charted course. They're accountable for making sure all the different functional areas work together effectively.
Exactly, but the executive is the captain. They're ultimately accountable for the entire ship and its journey, especially when there's a storm. Now here's the key insight. The captain doesn't run down to the engine room to fix a mechanical problem, and they don't climb up to adjust the sails themselves. Their job is different. They manage their own energy to stay clear-headed during the crisis, they set the ship's operating rhythm, they own the communication with the ship's owners, and when the ship goes off course, they're the one who stands on the bridge and says, "This is on me. Here's how we get back on course."
That last part is crucial. When things go wrong at the executive level, the natural human tendency is to explain why it happened, to point to external factors, to highlight the things that were outside your control. But executive-level accountability means starting with ownership, not explanation.
Right. Let me paint a picture. Imagine your company just reported a bad quarter, missing financial targets significantly. A manager's response might be, "My team hit all our delivery targets. The problem was with the marketing team's messaging. I'm focusing on fixing the tactical bugs that users complained about."
They're protecting their domain and focusing on what they directly control.
A director might say, "I'm protecting my team from the fallout. I've told them to keep their heads down and focus on executing our Q4 plan. I'm presenting a report showing how our department, at least, met its objectives." They're thinking about their broader area of responsibility, but still primarily in defensive terms.
But an executive's response is fundamentally different. I own this result. In my message to the company and our stakeholders, I will take accountability for the miss and lay out a clear 3-point recovery plan. I'm restructuring sales incentives to better align with our new strategy and leading the recovery effort personally. This is a moment to rebuild trust, not deflect blame.
Notice the difference. The executive doesn't start with explanation. They start with ownership. They don't just focus on their direct area of control, they take responsibility for the entire organizational outcome. And they immediately shift from what went wrong to what they're going to do about it.
This brings us to our second major concept, resilience. Because here's what most people don't understand about executive roles: the psychological demands are fundamentally different from other leadership levels. You're constantly operating with incomplete information, making decisions that affect hundreds or thousands of people, and doing so in an environment where the feedback loops are long and often unclear.
The stress isn't just about the workload, though that's certainly part of it. It's about the weight of ultimate accountability in an environment of high ambiguity. You might make a strategic decision today and not know if it was right for 6 months. You might have to communicate confidence to your organization while privately wrestling with significant uncertainty about the best path forward.
This is where executives need specific resilience strategies. It's not enough to just work harder or push through. You need systematic approaches to managing your own energy, mental clarity, and emotional state. Think of it like this. If you're the captain of the ship, your crew needs you to be clear-headed and decisive, especially during the storm. If you're running on empty or consumed by anxiety, that affects everyone.
One practical framework we've seen work is what we call the executive operating model. This is essentially a personal system for managing your time, energy, and key relationships at the senior level. It's different from typical time management because it acknowledges the unique demands of executive work.
The operating model starts with recognizing that executive work has different types of demands that require different kinds of energy. You need blocks of time for deep strategic thinking, the kind of work where you're synthesizing complex information and making long-term decisions. You need time for stakeholder management, the high-touch relationship work with board members, key customers, and other executives. You need time for team coaching and development. And critically, you need time for personal recovery and reflection.
Most executives fail because they let their calendar become purely reactive. They spend their days bouncing between urgent requests, immediate crises, and whoever managed to get on their schedule. But reactive scheduling is the enemy of executive effectiveness. Your calendar should reflect your strategic priorities, not just respond to others' demands.
Here's a practical way to think about it. Block out your week with different types of work. Maybe Tuesday mornings are for deep strategic work. No meetings, no interruptions, just you working on the big picture decisions that only you can make. Wednesday afternoons might be one-on-one stakeholder conversations. Thursday mornings for team development and coaching. And Friday afternoons for personal reflection and planning for the next week.
But the key is that this isn't just about time management, it's about energy management. Different types of executive work require different mental states. The focused analysis you need for strategic planning is different from the emotional intelligence required for managing a difficult board conversation, which is different from the coaching mindset needed for developing your team.
And here's where the resilience piece connects. You can't sustain the demands of executive leadership without deliberately managing your own recovery and renewal. This isn't about work-life balance in the traditional sense. It's about recognizing that your ability to think clearly and make good decisions under pressure is your most valuable asset, and you need to protect and nurture that asset.
This also ties into crisis communication, which is a critical executive skill. When things go wrong, and they will go wrong, your response sets the tone for the entire organization. There's a specific pattern that effective executives follow when communicating bad news.
First, they own it immediately. No hedging, no deflecting, no explaining why it wasn't really their fault. They start with accountability. Second, they state the facts simply and clearly. No sugarcoating, but also no unnecessary drama. Third, they explain the impact honestly, what this means for the organization, for stakeholders, for the future. Fourth, they outline a clear plan for moving forward. And fifth, they reiterate the broader vision and why this setback doesn't change the fundamental direction.
This pattern works because it rebuilds trust even in the midst of failure. People can forgive mistakes. What they can't forgive is leaders who won't own their mistakes or who seem to lack a clear path forward.
Now let's talk about the delegation component of the operating model, because this is where many new executives struggle. The shift to executive level requires you to fundamentally change what you spend your time on. There's a classic question every executive needs to answer clearly. What are the things that only I can do?
This is harder than it sounds because executives often rise through the ranks by being excellent at execution. They got promoted because they were great at solving problems, managing projects, analyzing data. But at the executive level, if you're doing work that someone else could do, you're not doing your job.
Think about it this way. There are certain decisions that require your level of context, authority, and strategic perspective. There are certain relationships that require your direct involvement. There are certain communications that need to come from you personally. Everything else should be delegated, not because you can't do it, but because your time is the organization's most constrained resource.
This brings us to a crucial point about resilience. It's not just about managing your own stress, it's about building organizational resilience through you. If you're the bottleneck for too many decisions, if too many things require your personal involvement, you're creating fragility in your organization.
Exactly. A resilient executive creates systems and develops people so that the organization can function effectively even when they're not directly involved in every decision. It's counterintuitive, but the more you can step back from day-to-day operations, the more value you're creating as an executive.
Let's talk about one more aspect of executive resilience, the psychological challenge of operating with incomplete information. Unlike other leadership levels, executives regularly have to make decisions where they don't have all the data they'd like, where the stakes are high, and where the feedback loops are long.
This is where executives need to develop what I call comfort with informed uncertainty. You'll never have perfect information, but you need to develop the judgment to know when you have enough information to make a decision and move forward. The paralysis of analysis is just as dangerous as reckless decision-making.
And this connects back to accountability. When you make decisions with incomplete information, some of them will turn out to be wrong. That's not a failure of leadership. That's the reality of executive work. The failure would be not making the decision or not owning the outcome when things don't work out as planned.
I think this is where we see the real difference between someone who has an executive title and someone who truly operates with an executive mindset. The executive mindset accepts that you will make mistakes, that some of your decisions will turn out poorly, and that your job is not to be perfect. It's to own outcomes, learn from setbacks, and keep moving the organization forward.
Before we wrap up, let's talk about the practical implementation of these concepts. If you're listening to this and thinking about how to develop these executive capabilities, where do you start?
I'd suggest starting with an honest assessment of your current operating model. Look at your calendar for the past month. How much time are you spending on deep strategic work versus reactive problem solving? How much time are you spending developing your team versus doing work they could do? How much time are you spending on personal recovery and reflection versus just pushing through to the next crisis?
And practice the accountability mindset in smaller situations. The next time something goes wrong in your area of responsibility, notice your first instinct. Is it to explain what happened and why it wasn't your fault? Or is it to own the outcome and focus on the solution? This is a muscle you can develop before you're in the high-stakes situation of owning a major organizational failure.
Also, start building your personal resilience practices now. Don't wait until you're overwhelmed by executive demands to start thinking about how to manage your energy and mental clarity. Whether it's regular exercise, meditation, time in nature, or whatever works for you, build these practices into your routine when the stakes are lower.
The key insight from today's discussion is that executive leadership isn't just about scaling up the skills that made you successful as a manager or director. It requires fundamentally different capabilities: the ability to own outcomes in environments of high uncertainty, the resilience to maintain clarity and judgment under intense pressure, and the systematic approach to managing yourself as the organization's most critical resource.
These aren't innate talents that some people are born with and others aren't. They're developed skills, and they can be learned and practiced. The executives who seem to handle pressure effortlessly and own outcomes gracefully, they've developed these capabilities through deliberate practice and systematic thinking about their role.
That's what we mean when we talk about demystifying the executive aura. It's not magic and it's not genius. It's a set of learnable skills applied with discipline and intention. The ability to take accountability, build resilience, and operate systematically at the senior level, these are capabilities any leader can develop.
This has been the Executive Mindset. We hope today's discussion has given you practical frameworks for thinking about accountability, resilience, and personal operating systems at the executive level. These skills form the foundation for everything else we've discussed in this series. Systems thinking, people development, and strategic execution all depend on your ability to own outcomes and maintain effectiveness under pressure.
Thank you for joining us for this final episode of our series on executive thinking. Remember, the goal isn't to wait until you have an executive title to start developing these capabilities. Start building these skills now, wherever you are in your leadership journey. The organizations that need strong leaders can't wait for you to figure it out on the job.